Sometimes life breaks us down so far that we forget what kindness looks like. For Caleb Thorne, returning to his childhood home after 30 years in the mountains, the sight of a desperate woman with a gun should have sent him running. Instead, he found her hiding in his family's abandoned homestead, starved, scared, and ready to fight anyone who came near. The whole town had given up on her, calling her nothing but trouble. But Caleb saw something in her eyes that reminded him of his own darkest days. He made a choice that would change both their lives forever. Instead of turning her away, he offered her shelter and taught her to rebuild with her hands instead of destroying with that gun. What happened next became the talk of Hollow Ridge for years to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley like memories that refused to fade. And Caleb Thorne stood at the edge of the meadow where his childhood had played out in simpler times. 30 years had passed since he'd last walked this path. 30 years since he'd fled to the high country with nothing but grief and a promise to his dying mother that he'd find his way back to goodness somehow. The wooden cross she'd carved with her own hands still hung around his neck, hidden beneath the layers of buckskin and wool that marked him as a man who'd chosen solitude over society. The homestead looked smaller than he remembered, its log walls weathered grey as winter bark, the roof sagging under the weight of seasons that had come and gone without witness. Weeds grew tall around the foundation, and the garden where his mother had coaxed life from stubborn mountain soil had surrendered to wild grass and Indian paintbrush. The front porch, where she used to sit evenings with her Bible and her quiet prayers, now leaned at an angle that spoke of time's patient work. Caleb had been 17 when consumption took her. 17 when he'd buried her in the little cemetery behind the church in Hollow Ridge. 17 when he'd realized that the world had no place for a boy who carried too much anger and not enough wisdom. The high country had been his teacher since then. The peaks and valleys, the harsh winters and brief summers, the animals that lived by instinct, and the weather that respected no man's plans or pride. He'd come down now because winter was closing in harder than usual, because his cabin up near Timberline had taken storm damage that would need a town's worth of supplies to repair. The homestead would shelter him through the cold months, and maybe, just maybe, being back in the place where his mother had taught him about grace would help him find some peace with the man he'd become. But peace wasn't what waited for him behind that weathered door. She couldn't have been more than 25, though the hard living had etched lines around her eyes that belonged to someone older. Her brown hair hung in matted strands around a face that might have been pretty once, before hunger and fear had hollowed out her cheeks and left her looking like something wild and cornered. She sat in the far corner of the main room, back pressed against the stone fireplace, clutching that rusty pistol with hands that shook from more than just the cold. "Don't come any closer," she said, and her voice carried the rasp of someone who'd been shouting or crying or both. "I ain't looking for trouble, but I'll make it if I have to." Caleb stopped just inside the doorway, hands visible and empty, the way he'd approach a wounded animal that might bolt or bite. "This is my family's place," he said, keeping his voice gentle as morning rain. "I'm not here to hurt you." That's what they all say. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and Caleb noticed the pistol's hammer was already cocked. One wrong move, one sudden sound, and that rusty old gun might just fire whether she meant it to or not. "What's your name?" he asked, settling down cross-legged on the dusty floor like he had all the time in the world. She studied him with eyes the color of creek water, looking for deception in the lines of his face. "Sarah May," she said finally. "Sarah May Hutchins. And before you ask, I know what folks in town say about me." Caleb had indeed heard the stories during his brief stop at the general store. A woman who'd blown into Hollow Ridge 3 months back with nothing but the clothes on her back and trouble following behind like a shadow. Some said she'd killed a man down in Colorado. Others claimed she'd stolen money from the family that took her in. The stories varied, but they all ended the same way, with decent folk crossing. the street when they saw her coming, and shopkeepers watching their till when she walked through their doors. Stories have a way of growing in the telling, Caleb said. What's the truth of it? Sarah May's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Truth is, I ran from a man who liked to use his fists more than his words. Truth is, I took what money I could find when I left. Figured I'd earned it after 2 years of being his personal punching bag. Truth is, I shot him when he came after me, but I aimed low, and he lived to tell lies about me to anyone who'd listen. She gestured around the empty room with her free hand. Truth is, I've been sleeping in barns and abandoned places for 3 months, trying to get far enough away that his reach won't find me. This place looked empty, and I was tired of being cold. Caleb looked around the room that had once been filled with his mother's warmth. The kitchen table where she'd taught him to read from the Bible. The rocking chair where she'd mended clothes and hummed hymns. The corner where she'd kept her small collection of books. All of it was gone now, sold or stolen, or simply carried away by time, leaving nothing but bare walls and the ghosts of better days. You pick a good place to hole up, he said. My mother always said this house had a way of sheltering folks who needed it most. Your mother? Been gone 30 years now. I've been living up in the high country since then, but I figured it was time to come back down and see what was left of home. Sarah May's grip on the pistol relaxed slightly, though she didn't lower it. You planning to turn me in? Collect whatever reward that bastard's put on my head? Caleb reached slowly into his shirt and pulled out the wooden cross his mother had carved. It was simple work, just 2 pieces of pine bound together with sinew, but every groove and line had been made with love and faith that even 30 years of weather hadn't managed to wear away. My mother used to say that God put broken people in each other's path for a reason. Maybe so they could help each other find the pieces. He tucked the cross back inside his shirt. I ain't turning you in, Sarah May. Question is, what are you planning to do with that pistol? She looked down at the gun in her hands as if seeing it for the first time, then slowly uncocked the hammer and set it on the floor beside her. I don't rightly know, she said, and for the first time since he'd walked through that door, she sounded like the young woman she really was, instead of the hardened survivor she'd had to become. Well, Caleb said, standing up and brushing dust from his pants, it's getting on toward evening, and this place gets cold when the sun goes down. You know how to build a fire? Sarah May nodded. Good. I'll see about finding us something to eat, and maybe we can figure out what comes next. He paused at the doorway. You got anywhere else to be? Nowhere that wants me. Then I reckon you can stay here long as you need to. This house has seen its share of lost souls finding their way home. As Caleb stepped outside to gather kindling, he felt the weight of his mother's cross against his chest and wondered if this was what she'd meant about God putting broken people in each other's path. Sarah May was running from something that had tried to destroy her, just like he'd been running from his own demons for 30 years. Maybe it was time for both of them to stop running and start building something instead. The sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. And for the first time since he'd come down from the mountains, Caleb Thorne felt like he might be exactly where he was supposed to be. The fire crackled between them like a bridge made of light, casting dancing shadows on the log walls that had once echoed with a different kind of warmth. Sarah May sat with her knees drawn up, watching Caleb prepare a simple meal of beans and hardtack with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned to make do with little. The rusty pistol lay on the floor beside her, forgotten for the moment but still close enough to reach if needed. Town's gotten smaller since I left, Caleb said, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon he'd whittled from a piece of birch. Half the shops are boarded up, and the folks that remain got that pinched look of people hanging onto something that's slipping away. Sarah May poked at the fire with a charred stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the gap in the roof where winter would soon find its way in. They got that look when they see me too. Like I'm some kind of disease that might spread if they get too close. Fear makes people small, Caleb said. My mother used to say that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing what's right, even when your knees are knocking. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. Took me 30 years to start understanding what she was trying to teach me. They ate in comfortable silence, the simple food tasting better than either had eaten in weeks. Sarah May kept glancing toward the windows, her body tensed like she was listening for sounds that only she could hear. Caleb noticed but didn't comment, recognizing the behavior of someone who'd learned that safety was always temporary and danger could arrive without warning. It was near midnight when the sound of horses reached them, multiple riders coming up the valley trail at a pace that spoke of purpose, rather than casual travel. Sarah May was on her feet instantly, the pistol back in her hands, her face gone white as milk in the firelight. "It's him," she whispered. "That son of a bitch found me." Caleb moved to the window and peered through a gap in the boards they'd used to block out the cold. 5 riders sat their horses at the edge of the clearing, their faces hidden by hat brims and shadow. The man in front was big enough to make his horse look small, with shoulders that stretched his coat tight and hands that rested easy on his gun belt. "Marcus Kane," Sarah May breathed behind him, and the name carried enough venom to kill a snake. "He always did have a talent for finding things that didn't want to be found. Your husband was, till I put a bullet in his leg and reminded him that marriage ain't slavery." Her hands shook as she checked the pistol's cylinder, counting bullets that wouldn't be near enough if shooting started. "He's got 4 men with him. Professional killers, not just ranch hands playing tough." Caleb studied the riders, noting the way they sat their horses and the practiced manner in which they'd positioned themselves to cover all the escape routes. These weren't men who made mistakes, and they weren't here for conversation. Sarah May Hutchins. The voice that boomed across the clearing was deep and confident, the voice of a man accustomed to having his words obeyed. "I know you're in there, darling. Time to come home and face the music for what you done." "I ain't your darling," Sarah May shouted back, though her voice cracked on the words. "And this is as far as you follow me." Marcus Kane's laughter rolled across the valley like thunder before a storm. "You always were spirited, I'll give you that. But you took something that belongs to me when you left. My money, my pride, and my property. All 3 of those things are coming back with me tonight." Caleb felt something cold and familiar settle in his stomach, the same feeling he'd carried as a young man when rage had been his closest companion. Sarah May wasn't property, and no amount of money was worth hunting a woman like an animal across half the territory. Some things were just wrong, clear and simple, and this was one of them. "She ain't going anywhere she doesn't want to go," Caleb called out, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "That you, mountain man? Heard about you in town, the hermit who comes down from the peaks like some kind of ghost." Kane's voice carried amusement now, like he was talking to a child who'd said something cute. "This ain't your fight, old-timer. Walk away now and you can keep breathing. Try to be a hero, and we'll plant you next to whoever else is buried in that little cemetery." "Funny thing about graves," Caleb replied, reaching for the rifle he'd leaned against the wall near the door. "Sometimes they're meant for different folks than the ones who dig them." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke, and Sarah May looked at Caleb with something approaching wonder. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "I made my choices, and I can live with whatever comes from them." "Choice is exactly what this is about," Caleb said, checking his rifle's action with movements that spoke of long familiarity with the weapon. "Every person gets to choose their own path, and no man has the right to force a woman down a road she doesn't want to walk." Outside, Marcus Kane was growing impatient. "I'm going to count to 10, Sarah May. Then my boys and I are coming in to collect what's mine. One way or another, you're leaving with me tonight." "1!" His voice echoed across the clearing. Sarah May moved to the opposite window, her pistol trained on the shadows where the riders waited. "I only got 5 bullets, she said. 2. "I got more than that," Caleb replied, settling into position where he could cover the front approach. "Question is whether we want to make this about shooting or talking." 3. "Kane ain't much for talking when he can take what he wants by force," Sarah May said. "He's the kind of man who sees compromise as weakness and mercy as stupidity." 4. Caleb thought about his mother's wooden cross, about her teachings on forgiveness and turning the other cheek. But she'd also taught him that protecting the innocent was a sacred duty, and sometimes that protection required a hard choice between peace and justice. 5, then I reckon we better make our shots count, he said. 6. Sarah May looked at him across the firelight, seeing perhaps for the first time that she wasn't alone in this fight. Why? She asked. Why risk your life for someone you just met? 7. Because 30 years ago I walked away from everything that mattered rather than stand and fight for what was right, Caleb said. I ain't walking away again. 8. The sound of leather creaking and metal clicking carried across the cold air as 5 men prepared their weapons and checked their positions. Whatever happened next would change everything for both of them, and they all knew it. 9. Caleb caught Sarah May's eye and nodded once. She nodded back, her jaw set with determination that reminded him of his mother when she'd made up her mind about something. 10. The silence that followed stretched like a bowstring pulled tight. And in that moment before violence erupted, Caleb Thorne made peace with whatever consequences his choice would bring. Some fights were worth having, and some people were worth fighting for. Sarah May Hutchins was both. The first shot shattered the night like thunder breaking over the mountains, splintering wood from the window frame where Caleb had positioned himself. He answered with his rifle, the boom echoing off the valley walls, as his bullet found one of Cain's men and dropped him from his saddle with a cry that cut through the darkness. That's for thinking an old hermit. Couldn't shoot straight, Caleb muttered, already working the bolt and scanning for his next target. Sarah May's pistol barked from the opposite window, the muzzle flash lighting up her determined face. Missed the bastard, she said through gritted teeth as Marcus Cain spurred his horse to better cover behind a stand of aspens. 4 left, Caleb called out, tracking movement in the shadows. They'll try to flank us. Cain's not stupid enough for a straight-up fight. The Homestead erupted in a storm of gunfire as the remaining attackers spread out, using the darkness and their knowledge of the terrain to close in from multiple angles. Bullets chewed chunks from the log walls and sent splinters flying like angry hornets. One shot came so close to Sarah May's head that it singed her hair, but she didn't flinch as she returned fire. Behind the woodpile, Caleb warned, swinging his rifle toward a shadow that had moved wrong. His shot sent the man scrambling back into the trees, cursing loud enough to wake the dead. The battle settled into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Cain's men probing for weaknesses, while Caleb and Sarah May held their ground from the increasingly damaged homestead. Every window was shot out now, and the front door hung crooked on its hinges from a shotgun blast that had come within inches of taking Caleb's head off. We can't keep this up forever, Sarah May said during a brief lull, reloading her pistol with bullets from a box she'd found in her saddlebags. I got maybe 12 shots left, and they got all night. Caleb reached into his shirt and pulled out his mother's wooden cross, holding it up to catch the firelight. The simple carved wood seemed to glow with its own warmth, reminding him of winter evenings when she'd sit by this same fireplace and tell him stories about David facing Goliath and Moses standing up to Pharaoh. My mother always said that being outnumbered just meant God was giving the other side a fair chance, he said, tucking the cross back into his shirt. Besides, we got something they don't. What's that? We're fighting for what's right, and they're fighting for money and pride. Righteous anger burns longer than greed, a new voice called out from the darkness, younger than Cain's, but carrying the same arrogant tone. Pa says to tell you this is your last chance, mountain man. Send out the woman, and we'll let you live to see morning. That's Tommy Cain, Sarah May whispered. Marcus's boy. Mean as a rattlesnake and twice as stupid. I always figured he'd end up dead in a ditch somewhere before he turned 20. How old is he now? 19, maybe 20. Old enough to know better, but young enough to think he's bulletproof. Caleb considered this information while scanning the tree line for movement. A father bringing his son along on a hunting party said something about the kind of man Marcus Cain was, the kind who'd pass his cruelty down like a family heirloom. And call it tradition, boys. Going to learn some hard lessons tonight. Caleb called back to the darkness, starting with the one about respecting his elders. Tommy Cain's laughter was high and wild, the sound of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "You're the one needs learning, old man, about what happens to folks who stick their nose in other people's business." The attack came from three sides at once, coordinated and vicious. Two men rushed the front while another came through what remained of the kitchen window, forcing Caleb and Sarah May to split their attention and their ammunition. Sarah May put 2 bullets into the man coming through the kitchen, dropping him across the sill with blood on his hands and surprise in his eyes. Caleb worked his rifle like it was part of his body, sending lead toward the front attackers with methodical precision. One man made it to the porch before a bullet caught him center mass and sent him sprawling across the boards, where Caleb's mother had once shelled peas and watched the sunset paint the mountains. 3 down, Sarah May reported, breathing hard but steady. "That leaves Cain and his boy, the dangerous ones," Caleb replied, already scanning for the next attack. "Cain's got 30 years of fighting behind him, and the boy's got nothing to lose because he doesn't understand what loss means yet." The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more calculating. Somewhere in the darkness, Marcus Cain was reassessing his strategy and coming to terms with the fact that the simple job of collecting a runaway wife had turned into a bloodbath that had cost him 3 good men. Sarah May, his voice boomed across the clearing, and this time there was steel in it instead of amusement. "You got spirit, I'll give you that. But you also got something that belongs to me, and I ain't leaving without it." "The money's gone," she called back. "Spent it on food and supplies weeks ago." "You came all this way for nothing." "Wasn't talking about the money, darling. I'm talking about you. You're my wife, bought and paid for, and I don't take kindly to having my property stolen." The words hit Sarah May like physical blows, and Caleb saw her flinch at each one. This wasn't just about catching a thief or collecting a debt. This was about a man who saw women as possessions and wouldn't tolerate being told otherwise. "I ain't your property," she shouted, her voice carrying years of suppressed rage. "I ain't anybody's property. The preacher might have said some words over us, but that don't give you the right to beat me and treat me like livestock." "The law says different," Cain replied. "And I am the law in my county." Caleb felt his mother's cross grow warm against his chest, and he thought about all the sermons she'd made him listen to about justice and mercy, about protecting the weak and standing up for what's right, even when the whole world seemed arrayed against you. "Your law don't reach into this valley," he called out, "and it sure as hell don't reach into this house. The lady's made her choice, and you'd best respect it, old man." Marcus Cain's voice carried the promise of violence like storm clouds promise rain. "You just signed your death warrant." The wooden cross seemed to pulse with warmth against Caleb's chest, and he found himself thinking about his mother's favorite Bible verse, the one about there being no greater love than laying down your life for a friend. Sarah May wasn't exactly a friend yet, but she was an innocent woman in need of protection, and sometimes that was enough. The second assault came with the cunning of desperation. Marcus Cain had circled wide through the timber, using skills learned from decades of hunting both animals and men, while his son Tommy created a diversion by shouting threats and firing wild shots from the front of the homestead. It was an old trick, but effective, especially in darkness against defenders who couldn't afford to waste ammunition on shadows. Caleb almost didn't hear the soft scrape of boots on the roof above them, almost. But 30 years in the high country had taught him to listen for sounds that didn't belong, and the whisper of leather against wood was as wrong as snow in July. "Above us," he whispered to Sarah May, pointing upward just as chunks of the ceiling began raining down where Marcus Cain was chopping through the roof with what sounded like a heavy axe. "Back room," Caleb said, grabbing his rifle and the ammunition box. "We can hold him off better from there." They moved quickly through the house that had once been filled with his mother's laughter and her quiet songs, now echoing with gunfire and the crash of splintering wood. Behind them, Marcus Cain dropped through the ceiling like a bear falling from a tree, landing hard but rolling to his feet with the grace of a man who'd done this before. "No more running, Sarah May," His voice boomed through the house, closer now and infinitely more dangerous. "Time to come home and face what you done." From the back bedroom that had once been his mother's sewing room, Caleb could see Tommy Kane moving through the main room, a lever-action rifle in his hands and murder in his young eyes. Father and son, working together to corner their prey like wolves hunting elk. "How many bullets you got left?" Caleb asked quietly. Sarah May checked her cylinder with practiced efficiency. "4, you? Maybe 8 in the rifle, 6 in my pistol." He touched the wooden cross beneath his shirt, feeling its familiar weight like an anchor in the storm. "Enough to make our point, I reckon." The first exchange came when Tommy Kane got careless, stepping into the doorway with too much confidence and not enough caution. Sarah May's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the wall where his mother's quilt rack had once stood. "Tommy!" Marcus Kane's roar shook dust from the rafters. "Boy, you answer me right now." "I'm hit, Pa," came the pained reply. "Shoulders busted up pretty good." The silence that followed was pregnant with the kind of fury that could move mountains or burn down forests. When Marcus Kane spoke again, his voice carried the promise of violence that would make the previous fighting seem like a church social. "You shot my boy," he said, each word falling like stones into still water. "Now I'm going to take my time with you, woman. Going to make you pay for every drop of blood he's spilled. He's still breathing," Sarah May called back. "Which is more than you deserve, considering what you've done to me over the years." From his position near the window, Caleb could see Tommy Kane trying to bind his shoulder with strips torn from his shirt. The boy was hurt but not dying, cursing steady and low while his father planned their next move. Blood loss would slow him down, but it might also make him more dangerous. Wounded animals often fought harder than healthy ones. "Tell me something," Marcus Kane said, his voice coming from somewhere near the front of the house. "What kind of man takes in a murderer and a thief? What kind of fool risks his life for a woman who ain't even his?" "The kind who learned the difference between right and wrong from his mother," Caleb replied, working his way toward a better firing position. "The kind who don't mistake strength for cruelty or ownership for love." "Your mother," Marcus laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "I heard about her in town. Sarah Thorne, wasn't it? The woman who died coughing blood, while her boy ran off to the mountains like a coward." The words hit Caleb like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to cut deep and leave scars. His mother's name in this man's mouth felt like blasphemy, a desecration of everything good and pure she'd represented. "Don't," Sarah May whispered, seeing the fury building in his eyes. "Don't let him bait you into doing something stupid." But the wooden cross around his neck seemed to grow heavier, and Caleb found himself remembering not just his mother's death, but the years before it, the way she'd worked herself to exhaustion trying to keep the homestead running after his father died. The nights she'd gone to bed hungry so he could eat. The mornings she'd collapsed in the garden and never really recovered. "She died believing you'd come back," Marcus continued, his voice like poisoned honey. "Died thinking her precious boy would find his way home in time to say goodbye. But you were too busy playing mountain man to be there when she needed you most." "Stop it," Caleb said, but his voice cracked on the words. "Stop what? Telling the truth? Your mother died alone, hermit. Dude calling your name while you were off hiding in the rocks like some kind of animal. What kind of son abandons his dying mother?" The guilt that had driven Caleb to the high country 30 years ago came rushing back like a flash flood, carrying away his carefully built defenses and leaving nothing but raw pain and self-recrimination. Marcus Kane had found the one wound that never healed, the one regret that had shaped every day of his exile. But then Sarah May's hand touched his arm, warm and steady and real. "He's lying," she said quietly. "He's trying to break you down so you'll make a mistake. Don't let him win." Caleb looked at her, this young woman who'd been beaten and hunted and driven to desperation, but still had the strength to offer comfort to a broken-down hermit. He thought about his mother's wooden cross and what she would have said about letting guilt and anger make his choices for him. "My mother died knowing I loved her," he said finally. his voice carrying across the damaged house with quiet conviction. And she's been guiding my steps ever since, even when I was too stubborn to listen. Tonight, she guided me to someone who needed help. And I ain't walking away from that calling. The wooden cross felt warm against his chest. And for the first time in 30 years, Caleb Thorne felt like he might be worthy of wearing it. Dawn was still hours away when the house fell silent except for the crackle of dying embers in the fireplace and the soft whisper of wind through the bullet holes in the walls. Marcus and Tommy Kane had pulled back to reassess their situation, leaving Caleb and Sarah May to tend their wounds and count their remaining ammunition by the fading light of the fire. "Let me see that cut," Sarah May said, noticing the dark stain spreading across Caleb's sleeve where a bullet had creased his arm during the last exchange. "It's nothing," he said, but allowed her to roll up his sleeve and examine the wound. Her touch was gentle but sure, and he found himself studying her face in the firelight, the determined set of her jaw, the way her eyes focused on the task at hand, despite the danger surrounding them. "You done this before," he observed, as she tore strips from her petticoat to make a bandage. "Had to learn." Marcus wasn't much for calling doctors when his temper got the better of him. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Caleb caught the tremor underneath. "Learned to stitch cuts and set bones and mix poultices for bruises. Learned a lot of things I never wanted to know." She wrapped the bandage with practiced efficiency, her fingers working by feel more than sight. "There. Should hold unless you plan on doing any heavy lifting." "Speaking of heavy lifting," Caleb said, checking his rifle's action, "we need to figure out what comes next." Kane's got patience now that his blood's cooled. And patience is dangerous in a man like that, as if summoned by his words. Marcus Kane's voice drifted across the clearing. Closer than before, but not close enough to pinpoint his exact location. "Sarah May, darling, I've been thinking about our situation here, and I believe we might be able to work something out." She moved to the window, keeping low, but positioning herself where she could see most of the yard. "What kind of something?" "Well, it occurs to me that you and I might have gotten off on the wrong foot during our marriage. Maybe I was a little harsh in my methods, a little quick with my hands when words might have served better." Sarah May's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "A little harsh? You broke 3 of my ribs and blackened both my eyes because I burned your breakfast. Now, Sarah May, there's no call to air our private business in front of strangers." Kane's voice carried a note of injured dignity, as if her accusations were somehow inappropriate rather than true. "Point is, I'm willing to let bygones be bygones if you're ready to come home and be the wife I know you can be." From his position by the opposite window, Caleb watched shadows moving between the trees. Tommy Kane was flanking wide to the left, favoring his wounded shoulder, but still mobile enough to be dangerous. The boy had learned something from being shot. He was moving with more caution now, using cover better. "And if I say no?" Sarah May asked. "Well, that would be unfortunate for everyone involved, especially your mountain man friend there. See, I done some asking around in town, and it turns out our hermit's got himself quite a reputation. Folks say he's been living rough up in the high country for 30 years. Ever since his mother died and he ran off like a whipped dog." Caleb felt his jaw tighten. But he kept his focus on Tommy's movement, rather than rising to the bait. "They also say," Kane continued, "that he's got some money put away. Gold dust and nuggets from prospecting claims that nobody knows about. Now, I ain't a greedy man, but it seems to me that a fella who's caused me this much trouble ought to pay for the privilege." "You think I'm going to tell you where his money is?" Sarah May's voice carried genuine amazement. "You think I'd betray the only person who's shown me kindness in months? I think you're a practical woman who knows when she's beat. I got resources you can't imagine, Sarah May. Men who'll hunt you across 3 territories if that's what it takes. Places I can reach that you might think are safe. Your mountain man might slow me down tonight, but he can't protect you forever." The truth of those words settled between them, like a stone dropped in still water. Marcus Kane wasn't just a violent husband. He was a man with connections, influence, and the kind of money that could buy silence from sheriffs and judges alike. Even if they survived this night, he would keep coming, Besides, Kane's voice took on a softer, more reasonable tone. I've been thinking that maybe what our marriage needs is some time apart. Let things cool down. Let you remember what you're missing. You come with me now, peaceful-like, and I'll let your friend here keep his money and his life. Hell, I might even let him keep his scalp. Sarah May looked across the room at Caleb, and he saw the resignation building in her eyes. She was thinking about accepting Kane's offer, sacrificing herself to save him from a fight she believed he couldn't win. Don't, he said quietly, setting down his rifle and reaching into his shirt to pull out his mother's wooden cross. Don't even think about it. The cross caught the firelight and seemed to glow with its own inner warmth. Caleb held it up so she could see the careful work his mother had put into every groove and line, the love that had shaped each careful cut of the knife. This here belonged to a woman who taught me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. She taught me that every person has value, that everyone deserves to choose their own path through life. He tucked the cross back into his shirt, feeling its weight settle against his heart. You ain't going nowhere with that man, Sarah May, not while I'm still breathing. But he'll kill you, she said, and there were tears in her voice now. He'll hunt you down, and then that's a risk I'm willing to take. My mother always said that a man's measure ain't in how long he lives, but in how he chooses to spend the time he's given. Caleb picked up his rifle and checked the action one more time. I spent 30 years running from what I should have faced. I ain't running anymore. Outside, Marcus Kane was growing impatient with the silence. Time's up, Sarah May. What's it going to be? She looked at Caleb for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time that some men meant what they said about protection and sacrifice. Then she picked up her pistol and moved back to the window. Go to hell, Marcus, she called out, and take your boy with you. The curse that erupted from the darkness could have blistered paint, and Caleb knew their brief respite was over. The real fight was about to begin. The attack that followed was methodical and merciless. Marcus Kane had abandoned any pretense of negotiation in favor of the kind of systematic violence that had built his reputation across 3 territories. He and Tommy worked in coordination now, one drawing fire while the other advanced, using the darkness and their superior knowledge of siege tactics to slowly tighten the noose around the homestead. They're trying to pin us down, Caleb observed, firing at a muzzle flash and hearing his bullets strike wood instead of flesh. Keep us shooting at shadows while they work in closer. Sarah May had moved to the kitchen window, where she could cover the approach from the barn. Smart. Marcus always was good at the long game when his temper wasn't ruling his head. A new sound reached them through the gunfire, the steady thunk of an axe biting into wood. Tommy Kane was working on the back wall of the house, chopping through the logs with the patience of a man who knew he had all night. He'll have a hole big enough to crawl through in another hour, Sarah May said, counting her remaining bullets for the 3rd time. I got 2 shots left, maybe 3 if I'm careful. Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch, the kind prospectors used for gold dust. Inside were a dozen bullets for Sarah May's pistol, each one carefully cast and loaded during long winter evenings in his mountain cabin. Where did these come from? She asked, accepting the ammunition with obvious relief. Man learns to be prepared when he lives alone in the high country. Game wardens claim jumpers, the occasional bear that won't take no for an answer. He smiled grimly. Your pistol's a common caliber. I've been carrying spare rounds for it since I came down from the mountains. The gift of ammunition was more than practical. It was a statement of faith, a declaration that he believed they would both live to see morning. Sarah May understood this without words, loading the fresh bullets with renewed determination. Tell me something, she said during a brief lull in the shooting. What made you come down from the mountains now? After 30 years, what changed? Caleb touched the wooden cross beneath his shirt, feeling its familiar weight. Been having dreams about my mother lately. Dreams where she's trying to tell me something important, but I keep waking up before I can understand the words. What kind of dreams? She's standing in this room right here where we are now, but the house is different. Clean and bright, with food on the table and flowers in her good vase. She keeps looking toward the door like she's waiting for someone, and every time I ask who, she just smiles and says, "You'll know when the time comes." A bullet shattered what remained of the kitchen window, sending glass fragments across the floor like scattered stars. Tommy was getting closer with that axe, the sound of splintering wood coming faster now. "Maybe she was waiting for me," Sarah May said quietly. "Maybe she knew you'd need someone to help you remember who you really are." The thought had occurred to Caleb, but hearing it spoken aloud gave it weight and substance. His mother had always believed in providence, in the idea that God moved people through each other's lives for purposes they might never fully understand. "She used to say that angels don't always have wings," he replied. "Sometimes they just have need, and helping them helps us find our way back to grace." Outside, Marcus Kane's voice boomed through the darkness with renewed fury. "Tommy, how much longer on that hole?" "Almost through, Pa. Another few minutes and I can squeeze inside." "Good, I'm tired of playing games with these two. Time to finish this once and for all." The words carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, and both Caleb and Sarah May knew their time was running out. Soon they would face Kane and his son in close quarters, with no room for maneuvering and no hope of retreat. "I need to tell you something," Sarah May said, her voice barely audible above the sound of splintering wood. "About the money I took from Marcus." "It don't matter," Caleb said, but she shook her head. "It does matter. I didn't just take his money, I took something else. Something he'd kill a dozen people to get back." She reached into her coat and pulled out a small metal strongbox, the kind banks used for important documents. "Marcus keeps records of everyone he's got in his pocket. Sheriffs, judges, territorial officials. Names, amounts, services rendered. Everything he needs to stay untouchable." Caleb stared at the box, understanding now why Marcus Kane had been willing to chase one woman across half the territory with a gang of killers. It wasn't about pride or property, it was about survival. Without those records, his empire of corruption would collapse. "You've been carrying this the whole time?" "Hidden in my saddlebags. I knew if he ever caught me without it, I'd be dead in an hour. With it, well, at least I got some protection." She handed him the box. "But if we don't make it through tonight, I want someone to know what's in here. Someone who might be able to use it to bring him down." The weight of the strongbox in his hands was nothing compared to the weight of what it represented. Justice for all the people Marcus Kane had corrupted or intimidated. Hope for all the victims who'd never gotten a chance to speak their truth. "We're going to make it through tonight," Caleb said, tucking the box inside his coat next to his mother's cross. "Both of us. And when morning comes, we're going to make sure this information reaches the right people." The sound of Tommy's axe stopped abruptly, followed by the scrape of wood against wood as he pulled away the pieces of the wall he'd chopped through. A cold draught swept through the house, carrying with it the promise of violence. "They're coming," Sarah May whispered. Caleb checked his rifle one last time and thought about his mother's wooden cross, about all the lessons she'd tried to teach him about courage and sacrifice and doing what's right, even when the whole world seems against you. Tonight, those lessons would be tested in ways she'd never imagined. "Then we better be ready," he said. The first thing through the hole in the wall wasn't Tommy Kane. It was a bundle of dynamite with a lit fuse, spinning end over end across the floor like a messenger from hell itself. Caleb had maybe 3 seconds to process what he was seeing before instinct took over, and he tackled Sarah May, driving them both behind the heavy oak table his mother had used for kneading bread. The explosion lifted the roof 6 inches off its supports before slamming it back down, filling the air with splinters and dust and the acrid smell of black powder. When the ringing in his ears subsided enough for him to think clearly, Caleb realized that half the back wall was gone and most of the kitchen had collapsed into rubble. "You alive?" He called to Sarah May, who was coughing and trying to clear debris from her eyes. "Think so," she managed. "Where did they get dynamite?" Before he could answer, Marcus Kane's voice boomed through the settling dust, closer now and thick with satisfaction. "Mining country, darling. Man can buy explosives easy as candy if he knows the right people. Tommy Kane stepped through the gaping hole where the wall had been, his wounded shoulder wrapped in crude bandages, but his rifle steady in his good hand. Behind him came his father, and behind Marcus came two more men that Caleb had never seen before, hard-faced professionals with the kind of weapons that spoke of serious money and serious connections. "Thought you killed all my boys." "Did you?" Marcus grinned, showing teeth stained with tobacco and malice. "These here are what you might call reinforcements. Cost me a pretty penny to bring them up from Denver, but some things are worth the expense." Sarah May counted the new arrivals with growing despair. 4 men now, and us with barely any ammunition left. But Caleb was studying the newcomers with the eye of a man who'd spent 30 years surviving in hostile territory, and something about them didn't sit right. They held their weapons like men who knew how to use them, but their eyes kept darting toward Marcus Kane with an expression he couldn't quite identify. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. "Funny thing about hired guns," the taller of the 2 newcomers said, his voice carrying the flat accent of Kansas plains. "Sometimes they get better offers than the one that brought them to the dance." Marcus Kane's grin faltered as both men swung their rifles toward him instead of toward Caleb and Sarah May. "What the hell?" "Deputy U.S. Marshal Jake Morrison," the tall man said, producing a badge from inside his coat. "This here's Marshal Tom Bradley. We've been tracking you for 3 months, Kane. Ever since a certain territorial governor decided your operation had gotten too big for its britches." The shorter man kept his rifle trained on Tommy while Morrison continued speaking. "Seems like some of the folks you had in your pocket developed a case of conscience when word got out that federal marshals were asking questions. Amazing how quick corruption falls apart when the consequences catch up." Marcus Kane's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fury, calculation, and finally a cold acceptance of changed circumstances. "You got no proof of nothing. Just stories told by people who got their own reasons for lying." "Oh, we got proof," Morrison said. "Question is whether we got all of it. See, we heard tell there might be some records floating around. Documents that could make our case airtight instead of just strong." Sarah May looked at Caleb, and he could see the understanding dawning in her eyes. The strong box she'd stolen wasn't just valuable to Marcus Kane. It was exactly what the federal marshals needed to bring down his entire network. "You're talking about these records," Caleb said, slowly pulling the metal strongbox from inside his coat. Marshal Morrison's eyes went wide. "Where did you—" "The lady here liberated them when she decided marriage to a wife-beating, murdering piece of garbage wasn't worth the trouble," Caleb replied. "Figured they might come in handy someday." "You give me that box right now," Marcus snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. "That's my property, and I'll kill every one of you to get it back." "Actually," Marshal Bradley said, cocking his rifle with a sound like breaking bones, "that there's evidence in a federal investigation, which makes threatening to kill folks over it a capital offense." The standoff stretched like a wire pulled tight. 6 people in the ruins of what had once been a warm family home, all of them armed and most of them desperate. The wooden cross around Caleb's neck seemed to grow heavier, and he found himself thinking about justice and mercy and the price of doing what's right when the stakes couldn't be higher. Tommy Kane broke first, his young nerves unable to handle the tension. He swung his rifle toward the marshals, finger tightening on the trigger, but Sarah May was faster. Her pistol barked twice, catching him center mass and dropping him across the threshold where his father had once planned to drag her back to a life of servitude and pain. Sound of gunfire released everyone else from the spell of indecision. Marcus Kane drew his weapon with the speed of a man who'd been killing people since before some of his victims were born. But Marshal Morrison was ready for him. Their shots came so close together they sounded like one. But only Morrison remained standing when the smoke cleared. "Well," Bradley said, surveying the carnage with professional detachment, "that's one way to end a federal investigation." Sarah May was staring at Tommy Kane's body with an expression that mixed relief with something that might have been regret. "He was just a boy," she said quietly. "A stupid, vicious boy, but still A boy who would have grown up to be just like his father if he'd lived, Morrison replied. You did the world a favor, miss. Question now is what happens next. Caleb looked around the destroyed homestead, seeing not just the physical damage, but the end of something that had been part of his life for 30 years. This place, where his mother had taught him about love and faith and doing right by your neighbors, would never be the same. But maybe that was appropriate. Maybe some things needed to be broken down completely before they could be built back better. What happens next, he said, handing the strongbox to Marshal Morrison, is that justice gets served. And maybe two people who thought they were alone in the world figure out they don't have to be. Sarah May looked at him with something that might have been hope beginning to bloom in her eyes. You sure about that? I come with a lot of trouble attached. Trouble's just another word for problems that haven't been solved yet, Caleb replied, touching the wooden cross beneath his shirt. And I got a feeling my mother would have liked you. She always did have a soft spot for folks who were willing to fight for what's right. Outside, the sun was finally beginning to rise over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise. For the first time in 30 years, Caleb Thorne felt like he might be ready to come home. The federal marshals spent the better part of the morning cataloging evidence and taking statements. Their methodical professionalism, a stark contrast to the violence that had preceded dawn. Marshal Morrison proved to be a thorough man, documenting everything from bullet trajectories to the contents of Marcus Kane's pockets. While Marshal Bradley worked through the strongbox with the focused attention of a scholar studying ancient texts. This is remarkable, Bradley said, holding up a leather-bound ledger filled with Marcus Kane's careful handwriting. Names, dates, amounts. He kept records like he was running a legitimate business instead of a criminal enterprise. Sarah May sat on what remained of the front porch, a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of coffee warming her hands. The marshals had been kind but thorough in their questioning, and the toll of telling her story, all of it, from the beginning, showed in the lines of exhaustion around her eyes. He always was meticulous, she said. Used to spend hours every night updating those books, cross-referencing payments and favors, like he was keeping track of a complicated recipe. I think it made him feel important, having all that information about powerful people. Caleb worked nearby, clearing debris from around his mother's old rocking chair, which had somehow survived both the gunfight and the explosion, with nothing worse than a few new scratches. The chair had been her favorite place to sit while she mended clothes or read her Bible, and finding it intact felt like a message, a sign that some things endure no matter how much violence tries to destroy them. You planning to rebuild? Morrison asked, looking around at the damaged homestead with the eye of a man who'd seen his share of destruction. Haven't decided yet, Caleb replied, setting the rocking chair upright and testing its stability. 30 years is a long time to be away from a place. Sometimes you come back and find it's not home anymore. Sometimes, Sarah May said quietly. Or you come back and find it's exactly what you needed all along. The words hung between them, like a bridge, waiting to be crossed. And Caleb found himself studying her face in the morning light. The fear and desperation that had marked her features the night before were gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like peace. Ma'am, Bradley said, approaching with the strongbox and the official-looking document. We're going to need you to testify when this case comes to trial. Could be months of legal proceedings, and you'll likely be the star witness. Sarah May's hand tightened on her coffee cup. Will I be safe? Marcus had a lot of friends, and some of them might not appreciate having their names in federal court. The territory's changing, Morrison assured her. Washington's decided that corruption in the frontier territories has gone on long enough. There's going to be a house cleaning that reaches from here to Denver, and the people responsible are going to face consequences. He gestured toward the strongbox. What you've given us doesn't just implicate Marcus Kane. It exposes a network that's been bleeding these territories dry for years. Judges who sold verdicts, sheriffs who looked the other way for the right price, territorial officials who treated their offices like personal businesses. Justice is coming, Bradley added. Real justice, not the kind that could be bought and sold like cattle, as the marshals prepared to leave with their evidence and their prisoners. The bodies of Marcus and Tommy Kane would be taken to Hollow Ridge for identification and burial. Caleb found himself alone with Sarah May for the first time since the shooting had started. "So," he said, settling into his mother's rocking chair and testing its familiar rhythm, "what happens now?" Sarah May stood at the edge of the porch, looking out over the valley where morning mist was lifting to reveal the mountains in all their autumn glory. "I suppose I find some place to stay while I wait for the trials to start. Maybe get work in town doing laundry or cooking for one of the boarding houses." "You could stay here," Caleb said, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. "I mean, if you wanted to. Place needs work, but the bones are solid. Might be good to have someone around who knows how to tend wounds and isn't afraid of hard labor." She turned to look at him, and he saw surprise in her eyes, not the shocked surprise of hearing something unwelcome, but the wondering surprise of hearing something too good to believe. "You sure about that?" "Like I said before, trouble seems to follow me around." "Trouble's already been here," Caleb replied, gesturing at the damaged walls and broken windows. "Can't get much worse, and it might get better with the right kind of company." He reached into his shirt and pulled out his mother's wooden cross, holding it up to catch the morning light. The simple carving seemed to glow with warmth, and he found himself thinking about all the lessons she'd tried to teach him about faith and forgiveness and the possibility of redemption. "My mother always said that God puts people in each other's path for a reason. Sometimes it's to teach us something we need to learn, and sometimes it's to help us become the people we're supposed to be." He tucked the cross back into his shirt, feeling its familiar weight settle against his heart. Maybe she was right. Sarah May walked back to where he sat and knelt beside the rocking chair, her hand resting on the worn wooden arm that had been smoothed by decades of his mother's touch. "What would she think of me?" she asked. "A woman who shot her own husband, stole his money, and brought violence to her son's childhood home." "She'd think you were brave," Caleb said without hesitation. "She'd think you were someone who stood up to evil when it would have been easier to accept it. She'd think you were exactly the kind of person worth fighting for." The sound of horses approaching interrupted their conversation, Marshal Morrison returning, with a wagon to collect the bodies and transport them to town. The practical business of death and justice still needed to be completed before they could truly begin to heal. "There's something else," Sarah May said as they watched the marshals load their grim cargo. "Something I haven't told you about what's in those records." Caleb waited, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would be important. "There's information about your father's death in there, about the mining accident that killed him when you were young." Her voice was gentle but firm. "It wasn't an accident, Caleb. Marcus had him killed because he was asking too many questions about safety violations and worker conditions." The words hit him like a physical blow, recontextualizing 30 years of memories and assumptions. His father hadn't died in a random cave-in. He'd been murdered for trying to protect other miners from the kind of corporate greed that treated human lives like acceptable losses. He knew. Sarah May continued, "Your father knew the mine owners were cutting corners on safety to save money, and he was planning to report them to the territorial authorities. Marcus arranged the accident to keep him quiet." Caleb felt his mother's cross grow warm against his chest, and he thought about justice and mercy and the long arc of consequence that had brought them all to this moment. His father's death had been the beginning of his family's tragedy, leading to his mother's exhaustion and early death, which had driven him to 30 years of exile in the mountains. But that same exile had prepared him to protect Sarah May, whose theft of Marcus Kane's records would finally bring justice for his father and countless others who had suffered under the weight of corruption and greed. "Then we make sure his death meant something," Caleb said finally. "We make sure every name in those records faces judgment for what they've done." As the marshal's wagon disappeared down the valley trail, carrying with it the bodies of their enemies and the promise of justice to come, Caleb and Sarah May stood together on the porch of the damaged homestead and watched the sun climb higher over the mountains. that had sheltered them both. The confrontation with the truth of his father's death hit Caleb harder than any bullet could have. He sat in his mother's rocking chair for a long time after the marshals left, the wooden cross heavy against his chest as he processed 30 years of misdirected guilt and grief. Sarah May busied herself cleaning up what she could of the damage, giving him space to work through the revelation that had changed everything he thought he knew about his family's tragedy. "All these years," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades spent blaming himself for running away. "I thought I was a coward for leaving after she died. Thought I was abandoning my responsibilities, turning my back on everything she'd taught me about duty and family." Sarah May paused in her sweeping to look at him. "You were 17 and grieving. No one expects a boy to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, but I did carry it," Caleb said, pulling the wooden cross from beneath his shirt and holding it up to the afternoon light. "Every day for 30 years. I carried the guilt of not being here when she needed me most, of choosing my own pain over my duty to her." The cross seemed to catch fire in the sunlight, its simple carved lines transformed into something that looked almost alive. As Caleb held it, he found himself remembering not just his mother's death, but her life, the way she'd hummed while she cooked, the stories she'd told him about faith and forgiveness, the gentle strength that had carried their family through his father's death, and the hard years that followed. "She knew," he said suddenly, the realization hitting him like lightning. "She knew what really happened to my father, and she never told me because she was protecting me from the truth." Sarah May stopped sweeping entirely now. "What do you mean?" "The dreams I've been having. The ones where she's waiting for someone in this room. She wasn't waiting for me to come home. She was waiting for this moment, for the truth to finally come out." He stood up from the rocking chair, the cross still warm in his hands. She was waiting for justice. The afternoon sun slanted through the broken windows, casting patterns of light and shadow across the damaged walls. In those patterns, Caleb could almost see his mother's face, peaceful at last, now that the secrets she'd carried alone for so long were finally in the open. "My father died trying to protect other miners from Marcus Kane's greed," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "My mother spent the rest of her life protecting me from the truth of his murder. And now," he looked at Sarah May, seeing not just the frightened woman who'd been hiding in his homestead, but a partner in the work of justice that his family had begun decades ago. "Now it's our turn," Sarah May said, understanding passing between them like a current of electricity. "Our turn to make sure the truth comes out, no matter what it costs. The trials will be dangerous," Caleb warned. "The people named in those records won't go down without a fight. And they'll have lawyers and money and influence we can't match. They'll also have the weight of their crimes against them," Sarah May replied. "And we'll have something they don't, the truth, and the courage to tell it no matter who tries to stop us." Caleb looked around the damaged homestead, seeing it now not as a ruin, but as a foundation for something new. The walls could be repaired, the roof could be rebuilt, and the rooms that had once echoed with his mother's gentle wisdom could be filled with purpose again. "There's something I need to do first," he said, tucking the wooden cross back into his shirt. "Something I should have done 30 years ago." He walked to the fireplace, where Sarah May had first pointed that rusty pistol at him, and began clearing away the debris that had accumulated during the fight. Underneath the broken stones and splintered wood, he found what he was looking for, a loose brick in the hearth that hid a small cavity his mother had used for storing important papers. Inside the hiding place was a folded letter, yellow with age, and sealed with wax that bore his mother's initials. His name was written on the outside in her careful handwriting, along with a note that made his throat tighten. "For my son, when he's ready to come home. She knew I'd come back," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She knew that someday I'd be ready to face the truth and do what needed to be done." Sarah May moved to stand beside him as he broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. His mother's words, written in her familiar script, seemed to reach across the years with love and wisdom and the kind of faith that could move mountains. The final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place, and with it would come the understanding that would transform everything Caleb thought. He knew about his family's legacy and his own purpose in the world. The letter trembled in Caleb's hands as he read his mother's words, written in the careful script he remembered from her Bible annotations and recipe cards. Each line revealed another layer of the truth she'd carried alone for the last years of her life. My dearest Caleb, if you are reading this, then the Lord has finally brought you home to face what I could not bear to tell you while I lived. Your father did not die in an accident. He was murdered by men who valued profit over human life. And I have spent every day since his death praying that someday justice would find them. I know you blame yourself for leaving after I passed, but you must understand, I wanted you gone. I wanted you far from this valley and the corruption that killed your father, because I feared they would come for you too if you started asking the right questions. You have your father's heart for justice, and that would have made you dangerous to them. Marcus Kane was the one who arranged it all. He owned the mine bosses, the sheriff, even the coroner who signed the papers calling it an accident. Your father found evidence of their safety violations, proof that they were sending men to their deaths to save money on proper timber and ventilation. The night before, he planned to take that evidence to the territorial authorities. The mine collapsed on him, and two other good men who had agreed to stand with him have hidden that evidence all these years, waiting for the right time, the right person, the right moment when justice might finally be possible. I believe that time will come through you, my son, because I raised you to know the difference between right and wrong, and I trust that when the moment arrives, you will have the courage your father showed. Sarah May watched Caleb's face as he read, seeing the play of emotions across his weathered features, grief, anger, understanding, and finally a kind of peaceful resolution that seemed to settle into his bones like warmth from a fire. "There's more," he said, his voice steady despite the tears that tracked down his cheeks. "The evidence is hidden, where you and I used to read Bible stories together in the old oak tree behind the house. Look for the hollow where the lightning strike left its mark when you were 10 years old. Everything is wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed in a tin box. I pray that whoever helps you in this work will be someone worthy of your trust and capable of the courage this fight will require. Do not face this alone, my son. Even the strongest man needs someone to stand beside him when he challenges the powers of this world. Remember that justice and vengeance are not the same thing. Seek the first, but let God handle the second. Your father died believing that good would eventually triumph over evil, and I have lived my life believing the same. Now it falls to you to prove us right. All my love and faith, your mother, Sarah Thorne." The letter seemed to glow in the afternoon light, and Caleb found himself thinking about providence and purpose, and the long arc of justice that had brought him from exile back to this moment. His mother had planned for this day with the same careful attention she'd given to everything else in her life, preparing him for a fight she knew he would have to face alone, except he wouldn't be alone. "The oak tree," Sarah May said, understanding immediately. "We need to find what she hid." They walked together behind the homestead to where the great oak still stood, its massive trunk scarred by the lightning strike that had split it down one side when Caleb was a boy. The hollow, his mother mentioned, was chest-high and deep enough to hide a small box, though decades of weather had partly filled it with leaves and debris. Sarah May reached into the hollow first, her smaller hands better suited to the narrow opening. When she pulled out the oiled cloth bundle, they both felt the weight of history in their hands, evidence that could have brought Marcus Kane to justice 20 years ago if the world had been ready for that kind of truth. "Your mother was remarkable," Sarah May said as they unwrapped the tin box. "To carry this burden alone for so long, to protect you while still believing that justice would eventually be served." Inside the box were documents that made Marcus Kane's corruption. Records look simple by comparison. Engineering, reports showing unsafe conditions, correspondence between mine owners and territorial officials. Witness statements from miners who had tried to speak up, and most damning of all, a letter from Marcus Kane himself ordering the accident that would silence Caleb's father permanently. "This changes everything," Caleb said, holding up the letter that had cost his father his life. "The federal marshals thought they had a corruption case. With this evidence, they've got murder charges that go back 20 years. The wooden cross around his neck felt warm against his chest. And for the first time since he'd fled to the mountains as a grieving 17-year-old, Caleb Thorne felt truly connected to his parents' legacy. They had both fought for justice in their own ways. His father with evidence and courage, his mother with patience and faith. Now it was his turn to finish what they had started. "We take this to the marshals," he said, carefully rewrapping the documents. "And then we make sure every person named in these papers faces judgment for what they've done." The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of his mother's favorite hymn about walking in the light. For the first time in 30 years, Caleb felt like he was doing exactly that. 6 months later, Caleb stood on the freshly rebuilt porch of the homestead, watching the morning sun paint the peaks in shades of gold and promise. The house looked different now, stronger somehow, with new timber reinforcing the old logs and windows that let in more light than the originals ever had. Sarah May's touch was evident everywhere, from the flower boxes under the windows to the vegetable garden that had reclaimed the space where his mother's herbs once grew. The trials were over. Every name in Marcus Kane's records had faced federal justice, and the additional evidence from his mother's hiding place had resulted in murder convictions that would see some of the territory's most powerful men spending their remaining years behind bars. The corruption network that had strangled honest development for decades was broken, leaving room for the kind of progress his father had dreamed of when he'd fought for miner safety all those years ago. "Coffee's ready," Sarah May called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the comfortable familiarity of shared mornings and settled routines. She testified with courage that impressed even the federal prosecutors, standing before packed courtrooms to tell the truth about Marcus Kane's crimes, without flinching from the hardest details. Her testimony had been the cornerstone that brought down not just her former husband, but the network of judges, sheriffs, and territorial officials who had enabled his reign of terror. Caleb touched the wooden cross beneath his shirt, feeling its familiar weight settle against his heart. The simple carving had guided him through the darkest period of his life, and back to a purpose he'd never imagined possible. His mother's faith had been vindicated in ways that went beyond her wildest hopes. Not only had justice been served, but her son had found his way home to the kind of life she'd always wanted for him. "Marshal Morrison's coming up the trail," Sarah May observed, joining him on the porch with 2 steaming cups. "Wonder what brings him back to our little valley." They watched the federal marshal approach on horseback, his presence no longer a harbinger of violence, but a reminder of how much had changed since that terrible night when gunfire had shattered the peace of the mountains. Morrison had become something of a friend over the months of legal proceedings, a man who appreciated both Caleb's quiet strength and Sarah May's unshakable courage. "Morning, folks," Morrison called as he dismounted. "Beautiful day to be alive and free in a territory where the law actually means something again." "Marshal," Caleb nodded. "What brings you back to Hollow Ridge?" Morrison grinned and pulled a folded document from his saddlebag. "Official business. Seems the territorial governor has decided that certain citizens who've shown exceptional courage in the service of justice deserve recognition." He handed the document to Sarah May, whose eyes widened as she read the official letterhead. "It's a pardon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A full territorial pardon for any crimes committed in connection with fleeing an abusive marriage. Governor figured that any woman brave enough to steal evidence that brought down the biggest corruption ring in territorial history probably had good reasons for whatever else she might have done," Morrison explained. "Plus, there's talk of statehood coming within the next few years." New state's going to need citizens with proven integrity to help build something better than what came before. Caleb watched Sarah May's face as the full meaning of the pardon settled in. She was truly free now, not just from Marcus Kane's violence, but from any legal consequences for the choices she'd made in escaping it. The shadow that had followed her across 3 territories was finally gone. "There's more," Morrison continued, turning to Caleb. "The Territorial Mining Commission has offered you a position as Chief Safety Inspector. Seems they think someone with your father's sense of justice and your own practical experience might be exactly what they need to make sure what happened to him never happens to anyone else." The offer hung in the air like morning mist, full of possibility and purpose. Caleb found himself thinking about his father's dreams of protecting working men from corporate greed, about his mother's faith that good would eventually triumph over evil, and about the life he and Sarah May were building together in the shadow of the mountains that had sheltered them both. "I'll consider it," he said finally, "but my first responsibility is to this place and the woman who's made it home again." Sarah May slipped her hand into his, her fingers strong and warm from years of hard work and harder choices. "We'll consider it together," she corrected gently. "Partners make decisions together." Marshal Morrison smiled and swung back into his saddle. "Take your time. Jub'll be there when you're ready. Territory's in no hurry. It took this long to get honest leadership. Another few months won't hurt." As the marshal rode back down the valley trail, Caleb and Sarah May stood together on the porch of the rebuilt homestead, watching the sun climb higher over peaks that held 30 years of memories and the promise of many more to come. "Your mother would be proud," Sarah May said, her head resting against his shoulder. "She would," Caleb agreed, feeling the wooden cross warm against his chest. "She'd say we proved her right about Providence putting broken people in each other's path so they could help each other find the pieces." "Are we still broken?" Sarah May asked. Caleb looked around at the homestead they'd rebuilt together, at the garden where new life was growing from old soil, at the mountains that had taught him patience and given him strength for the moment when he'd need it most. "No," he said, "I think we're exactly what we were meant to be." The wooden cross pulsed once against his heart, and Caleb Thorne knew his long journey home was finally complete.